Germany, June 1934. In a forest clearing north of Berlin, Adolf Hitler stands beside his most trusted deputy as a pewter coffin is lowered into an elaborate underground mausoleum. The deceased is not a military hero or a party leader. She is Carin Göring, the Swedish first wife of Hermann Göring, dead for nearly 3 years but now at the center of a Nazi propaganda spectacle. What happens next to her remains is a story stranger than any novelist could invent. A tale of vandalism and vengeance, destruction and denial, Soviet looting and secret burials, treasure hunters and DNA testing, spanning 8 decades across 2 continents. The question of what happened to the coffin of Hermann Göring's first wife after the Second World War is not merely a footnote to history. It is a window into the obsessions of the Nazi elite, the chaos of post-war Germany, the tensions of the Cold War, and the remarkable persistence of historical memory. To understand why Carin Göring's remains became entangled in one of history's darkest chapters, one must first understand who she was and why her memory mattered so deeply to one of Nazi Germany's most powerful men. Karin Axelina Hulda Fock was born on 21st October 1888 in Stockholm, Sweden, into a family of minor nobility with connections across Europe. Her father, Baron Carl Alexander Fock, was a Swedish army colonel from a family that had emigrated from Westphalia to the Duchy of Estonia, then part of Sweden, in the 17th century, before eventually settling in Stockholm. The Fock family had been matriculated into the Swedish nobility and maintained their aristocratic standing through generations of military and civil service. Her mother, Huldane Beamish, came from an Anglo-Irish family, famous for brewing Beamish and Crawford Stout in Cork, Ireland. Her great-great-grandfather, William Beamish, had been one of the founders of that brewery, and her grandfather had served in Britain's prestigious Coldstream Guards. On her mother's side, Carin also descended from a noted Swedish chemist, Carl Gustaf Mosander, whose daughter had founded a private religious sisterhood called the Edelweiss Society. This blend of Swedish nobility and Anglo-Irish industrial wealth gave Carin an upbringing of comfort and refinement. Carin was the 4th of 5 daughters in the Fock household. She grew into a tall, delicate, romantic woman with a taste for mysticism, the arts, and the sentimental literature of the era. Her health was never robust. From an early age, she suffered from epilepsy, heart palpitations, and respiratory difficulties that would worsen throughout her life. In 1910, at the age of 21, she married a Swedish army officer named Niels Gustaf von Kantzow. Their only child, Thomas, was born in 1913. The marriage was, by most accounts, an unhappy one. Kantzow was a devoted and dependable man, but their temperaments did not match. Carin found him dull. By the end of the decade, they were living apart, though still legally married. Everything changed for Carin in the winter of 1920. Her brother-in-law, Count Erik von Rosen, was a Swedish nobleman with adventurous tastes, an explorer, ethnographer, and aviation enthusiast. One winter evening, he needed a pilot to fly him home to Rockelstad Castle during a dangerous snowstorm. Most pilots refused. The only man willing to attempt the flight was a young German war hero named Hermann Göring. Born in 1893 in Rosenheim, Germany, Göring had been trained for a military career and had served with distinction as a fighter pilot during the First World War. He had taken command of the legendary Jagdgeschwader 1, Baron von Richthofen's famous flying circus, after the Red Baron's death, and had received Germany's highest military honours, including the Pour le Mérite, the coveted Blue Max. After the war, like many German officers, Göring found himself adrift. The Weimar Republic offered few opportunities for men of his background. He tried barnstorming, worked briefly at Fokker, and eventually drifted to Sweden, where he took a job as a commercial pilot for Svensk Lufttrafik, a fledgling airline. It was unglamorous work for a decorated hero, but it paid the bills. That stormy night, Göring flew Count von Rosen safely to Rockelstad Castle and was invited to spend the night. As he stood in the great hall of the castle, warming himself by the fire, he looked up to see a woman descending the staircase. It was Carin, visiting her sister Mary, the Count's wife. According to family accounts, their eyes met, and it was love at first sight. Göring was immediately smitten, captivated by her aristocratic bearing, her fragile beauty, her air of romantic melancholy. Carin, for her part, was drawn to this dashing aviator with his military decorations and tales of aerial combat. There was something irresistible about him, a mixture of confidence and vulnerability, ambition and injury. He pursued her with the same single-minded intensity he would later bring to politics. Their affair scandalized Stockholm society. Carin was still married with an 8-year-old son. Göring was a foreigner, unemployed, with no prospects, and a growing reputation for volatile behavior. They met secretly at first, then openly. Carin's parents were horrified, but she was determined. She left her husband and child and followed Göring back to Germany. The divorce from Canso was finalized in December 1922. On 3rd of January 1923, Carin and Hermann Göring were married in Stockholm. Remarkably, her ex-husband bore no apparent ill will. Niels von Canso provided a financial settlement that allowed the newlyweds to establish their first home together in a hunting lodge at Hochkreuz in the Bavarian Alps, near Bayrischzell, about 80 kilometers from Munich. In Germany, Carin threw herself into her husband's new passion, politics. Göring had attended a Nazi party rally in 1922 and had been mesmerized by Adolf Hitler's oratory. He joined the party and soon became commander of the Sturmabteilung, the brown-shirted stormtroopers who served as the party's paramilitary wing. Carin followed him into the movement and became, by all accounts, an even more fanatical Nazi than her husband. She was fiercely anti-Semitic and enthusiastically embraced the party's ideology. Their modest home in the Munich suburb of Obermenzing became a gathering place for the Nazi elite. Hitler, Rudolf Hess, Alfred Rosenberg and Ernst Röhm were regular guests. Carin served as hostess, charming the inner circle with her graciousness and fervor. Hitler, who rarely showed warmth toward women, was enchanted by her. She has been called the mascot of the Nazi party. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda chief, exploited the romantic love story between Carin and Göring to humanize the movement, presenting them as a heroic couple devoted to each other and to Germany's rebirth. On 8 November 1923, Hitler and Göring led the Nazi Party's attempt to seize power in Bavaria, the infamous beer hall putsch. The coup failed. Police opened fire on the marchers as they approached the War Ministry. Göring was shot in the groin and thigh. 14 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler and other leaders were arrested. Göring, badly wounded, was smuggled out of Munich by Carin and loyal comrades. They fled to Austria, where he underwent surgery. To manage the excruciating pain, doctors administered morphine. It was the beginning of an addiction that would plague Göring for the rest of his life. Carin nursed him devotedly, writing to her mother from his bedside about the agony he endured. For months, the Görings lived as fugitives, moving from Austria to Venice to Rome, dependent on the charity of Nazi sympathizers abroad. Göring met Benito Mussolini during this period, laying groundwork for future diplomatic relations between fascist movements. By 1925, the couple had returned to Sweden, where Göring's morphine addiction spiraled. Out of control, he became violent, attacking a nurse who refused his demands for drugs. He was certified as a dangerous addict and committed to Långbro Asylum in September 1925, where he was confined in a straitjacket until he could be weaned off morphine. Carin, herself chronically ill with epilepsy, heart disease, and what was diagnosed as tuberculosis, could not care for him. Her son Thomas remained with his father. These were dark years, the lowest point in Göring's life, but Carin stood by him. When a general amnesty allowed them to return to Germany in 1927, Göring resumed his political work for Hitler, and the Nazi movement began its rise to power. Carin's health continued to deteriorate. By her early 40s, she suffered from tuberculosis, chronic asthma, angina pectoris, and rheumatism. She spent increasing amounts of time in nursing homes and sanatoriums. When her mother, Huldine Fock, died unexpectedly on 25 September 1931, Carin was devastated. Despite her fragile condition, she traveled to Stockholm for the funeral. The next day, she suffered a massive heart attack. Hermann Göring rushed to her side. On 17th October 1931, 4 days before her 43rd birthday, Carin Göring died of heart failure in Stockholm, with her husband at her bedside. Göring was inconsolable. He had lost the great love of his life, the woman who had sacrificed her family, her health, and her homeland to follow him. Her body was interred in the Fock family plot at Lover churchyard on the island of Drottningholm in Lake Mälaren, just west of Stockholm. For Göring, who would soon rise to become the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, the grief never fully healed. He created altars to Karin's memory in every home he occupied, surrounding himself with her photographs, portraits, and personal belongings. Her older sister Fanny wrote a hagiographic biography that became a bestseller in Germany, cementing Karin's status as a kind of Nazi martyr, a romantic heroine who had given her life for the cause. But Göring wanted more than memory. He wanted a monument. When the Nazis seized power on 30th January 1933, Hermann Göring became one of the most powerful men in Europe. As president of the Reichstag, minister without portfolio in Hitler's cabinet, and head of the Prussian police, he wielded enormous authority. He founded the Gestapo, established the first concentration camps for political prisoners, and began rebuilding Germany's air force in secret violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Yet even at the height of his power, his thoughts returned constantly to Carin. Later that year, he returned to Sweden for a family wedding and made a pilgrimage to her grave at WW2 churchyard. There, in a gesture that would have profound consequences, he laid a wreath of red roses shaped like a swastika on her headstone. The Swedish press photographed and publicized the tribute. Anti-Nazi Swedes were outraged. Within days, someone had removed the wreath and vandalized the grave. A paper was glued to the headstone that read, "We a few Swedes feel insulted because of Hermann the German's grave desecration. May his wife rest in peace, but save us from German propaganda on the gravestone." The incident was reported in newspapers across Europe and became a minor diplomatic scandal. Göring was humiliated and enraged. He decided that Karin's body must be removed from Swedish soil and brought to Germany, where he could protect her memory and honor her properly. What followed was a project that revealed both the depth of Göring's obsession and the grandiosity of the Nazi regime. In the summer of 1933, Göring commissioned the architect Werner Marsch, who would later design Berlin's Olympic Stadium, to build a hunting lodge on a vast estate in the Schorfheide forest, one of Central Europe's largest nature preserves, some 60 kilometers northeast of Berlin. The site lay between the lakes of Großdellner See and Wückersee, in the north of Brandenburg. Göring named the estate Carinhall. The first phase of construction produced a Swedish-style hunting lodge in timber, relatively modest compared to what would come later. But nearby, in a small forest clearing on the shores of the Wückersee, Göring ordered the construction of something far more elaborate. An underground mausoleum to house Karin's remains, and eventually, his own. The mausoleum was built of reinforced concrete, designed to last for centuries. Its walls were lined with tiles. A ceremonial entrance led down into the crypt, where the coffin would rest on a stone platform. Göring intended it to be a sacred space, a place of pilgrimage for himself and for admirers of the Nazi cause. The construction was carried out with the resources of the state, reflecting Göring's position as one of the regime's most powerful figures. On 19th June 1934, Karin's coffin was exhumed from WW2 churchyard under the supervision of German officials. The scene was documented by photographers from the Reich. Workers carefully raised the casket from the earth, cleaned and prepared it, and draped it in a swastika flag. The original wooden coffin was placed inside a new casket of pewter, then encased in an additional zinc coffin for protection. The remains were transported by train from Stockholm to the Swedish port of Trelleborg, where they were loaded onto the ferry Drottning Victoria at 4 o'clock in the morning on 20th June. By 9 o'clock that morning, the train carrying Karin's body rolled into Eberswald station, the closest stop to Carinhall. 500 German soldiers stood in formation on the platform. Surrounded by motorcycle police, a horse-drawn carriage carried the coffin through crowds of onlookers to the estate, escorted by mounted police for the final stretch. The reburial ceremony was a major Nazi propaganda event. Adolf Hitler himself attended, along with Rudolf Hess, Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, and other senior figures of the regime. Photographs from the day show Hitler and Göring ascending the steps from the mausoleum after the interment, wreaths of flowers surrounding the entrance. For Göring, it was a moment of personal triumph and public validation. His beloved Carin now rested on German soil in a monument befitting her importance to him and to the movement they had built together. For nearly 11 years, Carin rested peacefully in the mausoleum at Carinhall. Göring visited the tomb almost daily when he was in residence at the estate. He filled Carinhall itself with images and mementos of his first wife. Paintings, photographs, personal effects, even an altar dedicated to her memory in his Berlin apartment. When he remarried in April 1935 to the German actress Emmy Sonnemann, his new wife apparently made no objection to living in a house named for her predecessor and having the late wife's remains so near. The wedding banquet itself was held at Carinhall, with Hitler among the guests. Emmy later wrote in her memoirs that she accepted Göring's devotion to Karin's memory as part of who he was. Throughout the late 1930s, Carinhall grew into an enormous complex, a monument to Göring's vanity, his love of luxury, and his insatiable appetite for status. The original hunting lodge was repeatedly expanded and rebuilt. By 1940, the estate included a main house with vast reception halls, multiple guest wings, a gymnasium, a movie theatre, and elaborate gardens. Göring appointed himself Reichsmaster of the Hunt and Reichsmaster Forester, using these titles to justify his dominion over the Schorfheide and surrounding forests. He introduced deer and other game animals for hunting, kept pet lion cubs that he borrowed from the Berlin Zoo, and held lavish hunting parties for dignitaries and guests. The main hall at Carinhall became a repository for one of the largest private art collections in Europe, much of it looted from occupied countries and confiscated from Jewish owners. Göring worked closely with the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the Nazi organization responsible for seizing cultural property across occupied Europe. He personally visited the Jeu de Paume depot in Paris at least 17 times between 1941 and 1942, selecting paintings and sculptures for his collection from the plundered holdings of French Jewish families. Carinhall's halls were hung with works by Rembrandt, Rubens, Vermeer, and other old masters. Sculptures, tapestries, antiquities, and precious objects filled every room. When the Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka visited Carinhall in 1941, he remarked that it was more like a museum than a home. Heads of state and foreign dignitaries came regularly: Mussolini, the Duke of Windsor, the King of Siam, and many others. By 1945, the Reich that Göring had helped build was collapsing. The Red Army was advancing from the east. Allied bombers pounded German cities day and night. The Schorfheide was no longer safe. Göring had already begun moving art treasures out of Carinhall, first to a converted salt mine in Austria, then to tunnels near Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. As late as January 1945, he was still being shown architectural plans for a vast expansion of Carinhall into a personal museum, a project he hoped to complete in time for his 60th birthday in 1953, but reality was closing in. On 20th April 1945, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, Göring departed Carinhall for the last time, travelling to Berlin to attend the celebrations at the Führerbunker. He understood that he would not return. Before leaving, he issued orders. The estate was to be destroyed before it could fall into enemy hands. Everything that could not be evacuated was to be blown up. Curiously, however, Göring made no provision to save Karin's body. He must have known that Soviet soldiers were unlikely to respect the grave of a Nazi leader's wife. Whether this was an oversight born of chaos, a practical calculation that the mausoleum's reinforced concrete would survive, or some darker impulse that historians can only speculate about, the record does not say. On 20th April 1945, a small Luftwaffe demolition squad carried out Göring's orders. Captain Frankenberg and his men poured petrol through the lavish halls of Carinhall, placed more than 80 aircraft bombs throughout the complex, and detonated the charges as Soviet troops approached. The explosion was massive. The main buildings collapsed into rubble. The art treasures that remained behind were scattered, burned, and destroyed. Only the monumental entrance gates, a few foundation structures, and decorative stones survived. In the following days, Red Army soldiers and local German civilians picked through the debris, looting whatever they could find. The mausoleum, however, built of reinforced concrete, remained partially intact beneath the devastation. Soviet troops discovered it soon after arriving at the site. According to multiple accounts, they looted the crypt, searching for valuables among the rubble. They tipped Karin's coffin and scattered her skeletal remains across the tiled floor. Some accounts suggest that a local forester named in various sources secretly retrieved some of the bones and reburied them elsewhere in the forest before the Soviets could destroy them. Others claim that the remains lay undisturbed for years, forgotten amid the chaos of occupation. Soviet engineers attempted to demolish the mausoleum itself, but the reinforced concrete proved too strong for their explosives. Eventually, they filled parts of the structure with debris and abandoned the effort. Meanwhile, Hermann Göring's own fate was sealed. Captured by American forces on 7th of May 1945 at Schloss Fischhorn in Austria, he was put on trial at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity. He defended himself aggressively, showing flashes of the intelligence and arrogance that had marked his career, and was found guilty on all counts. On 15th October 1946, hours before his scheduled execution by hanging, Göring swallowed a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled into his cell. The source of the poison has never been definitively established, and died in his prison bunk. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered secretly to prevent any memorial from being created. He never returned to Carinhall. He never learned what had become of his first wife's remains. In the years after the war, the Schorfheide forest fell within the Soviet occupation zone, and after 1949, within the territory of the German Democratic Republic. The East German government had no desire to preserve anything associated with Göring or the Nazi regime. The remaining ruins of Carinhall were systematically demolished in the early 1950s to deter any possibility of the site becoming a pilgrimage destination for neo-Nazis or nostalgists for the Third Reich. The area was designated part of the Schorfheide-Chorin Biosphere Reserve and placed under strict access restrictions. For decades, ordinary East German citizens were forbidden from entering the grounds. The communist authorities wanted Carinhall and everything associated with it to vanish from history. Yet even behind the Iron Curtain, the story of Carin Göring's remains refused to end. In 1951, according to the Swedish writer and journalist Björn Fontander, who documented the story in his book Göring och Sverige, skeletal elements believed to belong to Carin were discovered near the ruins of Carinhall. The remains, described as not more than a human torso, were handed over to a Swedish minister named Heribert Jansson, who served at the Swedish church in Berlin during the difficult post-war years. The new communist government in East Germany had explicitly forbidden the removal of any remains associated with the Nazi elite to foreign soil. Pastor Jansson, however, was determined to return Carin to her homeland. Under a faked name and with falsified documentation, Jansson arranged for the remains to be cremated at the crematorium in Wilmersdorf, Berlin, on 3rd February 1951. He then placed the urn in his backpack, boarded a train and smuggled the ashes across the border into Sweden. Following this undignified homecoming, so different from her formal journey in the other direction 17 years earlier, Carin Göring's supposed remains were reinterred in the Fock family plot at Lovo churchyard, the same grave from which they had been exhumed in 1934. For the Fock family and for Pastor Jansson, it was an act of closure. Carin had finally come home. For 4 decades, the matter appeared to be settled. Carin Göring lay at rest in Sweden. The ruins of Carinhall mouldered beneath the trees of the Schorfheide, forbidden and forgotten. The site was used occasionally by Communist Party leaders for hunting retreats, but it held no official status and received no public attention. The Cold War froze the region in a kind of historical amber. Then, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Germany reunified the following year. The Schorfheide was no longer off limits. Historians, journalists, and curious visitors began exploring the site, and treasure hunters arrived with metal detectors and shovels. In 1999, a German book titled Göring's Reich, Selbstinszenierungen in Carinhall, renewed public interest in the estate. Written by Volker Knopf and Stefan Martens, the book documented the history and layout of Göring's residence with unprecedented detail, including maps, photographs, and architectural plans. For treasure hunters, it was irresistible. Rumours had long circulated that Göring had hidden vast quantities of gold, art, and valuables somewhere in the grounds, perhaps in underground bunkers, perhaps at the bottom of the nearby lake. Men and women with metal detectors began combing the forest, digging among the rubble, hoping to find remnants of the Reichsmarschall's splendour. Concerns grew that the site might become a shrine for neo-Nazis, with reports of extremist gatherings on Hitler's birthday. In 1991, a group of treasure hunters made an unexpected discovery. While excavating near the location of the destroyed mausoleum, they uncovered a zinc coffin containing skeletal remains. The men filmed their discovery with a video camera. The story was published in Super Illu, an East German magazine. Inside the coffin were 26 bones, skull fragments, arm bones, ribs, vertebrae, belonging to an adult woman. The coffin itself was the original casket used in 1931, now encased in the additional metal coffins Göring had ordered for the 1934 reburial. Whoever was inside had been buried with care and ceremony, protected by multiple layers of metal. The question was immediate and obvious. Were these the remains of Carin Göring? And if so, whose bones had Pastor Jansen smuggled back to Sweden in 1951? The treasure hunters turned the coffin over to the Swedish church in Berlin, which sent it to the Swedish National Board of Forensic Medicine. For reasons that remain unclear, perhaps bureaucratic confusion, perhaps sensitivity about the subject, the remains then sat for nearly 2 decades without definitive identification. In 2009, they were transferred to Uppsala University in Sweden, where Professor Marie Allen and her colleagues in the Department of Immunology, Genetics and Pathology finally undertook a comprehensive forensic analysis. The investigation combined anthropological examination with cutting-edge DNA analysis. The anthropological assessment confirmed that the bones belonged to an adult woman of European ancestry. The skull showed evidence of hyperostosis frontalis interna, a thickening of the inner skull bone often associated with metabolic conditions and hormonal imbalances in women, particularly those who had experienced multiple health problems. Carin Göring had suffered throughout her life from epilepsy, heart disease, tuberculosis, and chronic respiratory issues, a profile consistent with the skeletal findings. The remains showed no signs of trauma or violent death, consistent with a natural death from heart failure. For the DNA analysis, researchers needed a reference sample from a known biological relative. Carin's only child, Thomas von Canso, had died by suicide in May 1973 at the age of 61. His life marked by the traumas of his mother's abandonment, his stepfather's notoriety, and his own struggles with mental illness. Fortunately, tissue samples from Thomas had been preserved as formalin-fixed, paraffin-embedded specimens, the kind of medical samples routinely kept for diagnostic purposes. Using these samples, the team extracted mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA markers for comparison. The mitochondrial DNA analysis revealed sequences identical between the skeleton and Thomas von Canso, indicating a maternal relationship. The bones and Thomas had the same mother. However, the particular mitochondrial variant was relatively common, occurring in about 10% of Europeans, which limited its evidentiary value on its own. The researchers pushed further into nuclear DNA analysis, which is more difficult with degraded and ancient samples, but provides much stronger identification power. They successfully typed several genetic markers, including T801, D7S820, and D8S1149. For each marker, the remains and the reference sample from Thomas shared at least one allele, strongly supporting a mother-son relationship. When combined with the anthropological findings and the historical circumstances of the discovery, the precise location near the destroyed mausoleum, the distinctive layered coffins, the burial method that matched historical records, the evidence pointed overwhelmingly in one direction. In December 2012, Professor Marie Allen and her colleagues published their findings in the peer-reviewed scientific journal PLOS 1. The title was Clinical and Understated, an analysis of the alleged skeletal remains of Carin Göring. Their conclusion was clear. The bones found by treasure hunters in 1991 were, in all probability, those of Carin Göring herself. This raised an obvious and troubling question. What, then, had Pastor Hermann Jansen smuggled back to Sweden in 1951? The remains he retrieved from the vicinity of the looted mausoleum were cremated and interred at WW2 churchyard. But if Carin's actual skeleton was still in Germany, encased in her original coffin and buried near Carinhall, then Jansen had cremated and transported the bones of someone else, or perhaps only a partial, scattered collection of bones left behind during the Soviet looting. The mystery may never be fully resolved. Soviet soldiers searching for valuables would not have been careful with skeletal remains. Bones could have been scattered widely. Jansen may have gathered what he could find, believing them to be Carin's, without any way to verify their identity in post-war Berlin. Following the DNA identification in 2012, Swedish authorities arranged for the 1991 remains to be repatriated. Carin Göring was cremated once more and reinterred alongside her family at WW2 churchyard, nearly 81 years after her death. The grave, modest and unremarkable bears the Fock family name and offers no hint of the extraordinary journey her remains had taken, from Stockholm to Berlin, from a Nazi mausoleum to a Soviet looted crypt, from a treasure hunter's shovel to a university forensic laboratory, and finally home again. The site of Carinhall itself remains a contested and uneasy space. After German reunification, concerns intensified that the ruins might become a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis and admirers of the Third Reich. In 1999, following the publication of Göring's Reich and increased treasure hunter activity, the state government of Brandenburg ordered the remaining structures of the mausoleum demolished. Stone markers that had been placed near the site